Easter at Hawthorne House. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Hawthorne. The carriage crested the final hill, and Miss Clara Whitmore felt her breath catch in her throat. Below, cradled in the lush green valley like a jewel in a velvet case, lay Hawthorne House. It was not merely a house, it was a monument. Its honey-coloured stone glowed in the late afternoon sun, its many windows winking like 1,000 golden eyes. Grand terraces swept down to formal gardens, which in turn melted into a parkland dotted with ancient oaks just beginning to unfurl their new leaves. In the distance, the spire of St. Michael's Church pierced the soft blue sky, a beacon for the village nestled beside it. This was the seat of the Earls of Ashbourne, and for one Easter weekend, Clara Whitmore was to be a guest within its hallowed walls. She drew a deep, steadying breath, her gloved hands tightening on the worn leather of her reticule. Beside her, her Aunt Beatrice, the widow of a prosperous merchant, was a flurry of excited rustling. "There it is, Clara. Did I not tell you? Nothing else like it in the county. And the Dowager Countess's Easter celebrations are the talk of the season. Lady Egremont's daughter secured her engagement after last year's garden party, you know. The possibilities are endless." Clara managed a smile, though it felt fragile on her lips. "It is magnificent, Aunt." Magnificent was the correct word, but it was also a word that underscored the chasm between her own circumstances and those of the people she was about to meet. At 24, Clara was a gentlewoman of modest means, the orphaned daughter of a country parson. Her father had left her with a small annuity, a fine education, and a wardrobe that was respectable but a decade out of fashion. Her invitation to Hawthorne House had come not for her own consequence, but as a companion to her aunt, a woman whose wealth had purchased her entry into the fringes of the ton. Clara was an accessory, a well-bred ornament to validate her aunt's social climbing. The carriage rolled through the great iron gates, past a lodge-keeper who touched his hat, and along a sweeping driveway lined with lime trees. Soon, they joined a queue of elegant carriages depositing a stream of titled ladies in silk and gentlemen in immaculate tailoring. Clara felt a familiar prickle of inadequacy. Her gown, a sprigged muslin in a soft lilac, was clean and well made, but it paled beside the rich velvets and intricate embroidery swirling around her. Aunt Beatrice, resplendent in sapphire blue, was already assessing the competition. "Lady Jersey is here, I see, and the Bishop of Bathurst. My word, is that Lord Pemberton? Clara, do stand up straight. Remember, we are the guests of the Dowager Countess. We must project an air of ease." Ease. Clara was beginning to suspect she would feel anything but. They were ushered into a grand entrance hall that soared up to a painted ceiling depicting cherubs and clouds. Footmen in powdered wigs and green livery moved with silent efficiency, taking cloaks and directing guests towards the main drawing room. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, hothouse flowers, and expensive perfume. Aunt Beatrice was immediately swept into conversation with a friend she had spotted, leaving Clara momentarily adrift. She stood near a colossal marble fireplace, observing the glittering tableau. There were officers in scarlet coats, their brass buttons gleaming, clergymen in sober black, murmuring in corners, and everywhere, women in gowns of every pastel shade, their heads adorned with plumes and ribbons. The noise was a pleasant hum of laughter, gossip, and the clink of teacups. Her gaze drifted towards a set of tall, arched windows that looked out over the west lawn. A small group was gathered there, and at its centre was a man who seemed to command the space without effort. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled his dark blue coat to perfection. His hair was the colour of dark sand, slightly longer than was fashionable, and he stood with an air of quiet, detached authority. Even from across the room, Clara could sense the controlled energy within him, a sense of a man who was constantly observing, constantly evaluating. This, she knew without being told, was Lord Ashbourne, the heir to Hawthorne House. He was listening to a lady in a magnificent rose-coloured gown, his expression polite but distant. Then, as if sensing her scrutiny, his gaze lifted and met hers across the crowded room. Clara's heart gave a sudden, traitorous lurch. His eyes were the cool, clear grey of a winter sky, and for a moment they held hers with an unsettling intensity. She felt a blush creep up her neck. She was the one to look away first, flustered, focusing intently on a particularly intricate carving on the mantelpiece. When she dared to glance back, he had turned his attention back to his companions, his face once again an unreadable mask. Foolish, she chided herself. He was merely looking to see who had entered. You are no one of consequence. She spent the rest of the afternoon in her aunt's wake, exchanging pleasantries with a variety of guests. Lady Beatrice, true to her mercantile roots, was a master of commerce, and she was here to trade in the currency of social connection. Clara was introduced to a bashful young curate who spoke only of his cabbage patch, a major general who regaled them with hunting stories, and a fluttery lady who was appalled that the dowager had decided to serve cold asparagus soup at the garden party. Clara listened, smiled, and murmured the appropriate responses, all while feeling like a character in a play who had not been given the full script. It was a relief when a footman announced that a cold collation was being served in the dining room, and guests were free to retire to their chambers before the evening's formal ball. Clara gratefully accepted her aunt's suggestion that they freshen up. Their rooms were in the east wing, a suite of 2 bedchambers connected by a small sitting room. Clara's chamber, though modest by Hawthorne standards, was larger than any room she had ever inhabited. A 4-poster bed draped in cream silk stood against one wall, and a window seat overlooked a walled garden where the first tulips were beginning to bloom. A fire crackled in the grate, warding off the spring chill. As her maid, a nervous girl assigned to her for the weekend, helped her unpack, Clara walked to the window. From this vantage point, she could see the rolling parkland and, in the distance, the spire of St. Michael's. Her father would have loved this place, she thought. He would have admired the order of the gardens, the ancient stones, the sense of history that clung to every wall. A familiar ache bloomed in her chest. It had been 5 years since his death, but the grief still surfaced at unexpected moments. Easter had been his favourite time of year, a season of hope and resurrection. He would have said that this grand estate, with its promise of spring renewal, was a testament to God's own artistry. She was still gazing out when a knock sounded on the door, and her aunt swept in, a garment bag over her arm. "Now, Clara, for this evening. I've had my dressmaker alter one of my gowns for you. It is a trifle grand, but it will do. You cannot wear that lilac muslin to a ball." Clara's heart sank. She knew the gown her aunt referred to, a gown of pale yellow silk, beautiful but cut for a woman of her aunt's more ample figure. She had no choice but to accept. The gown, once on, was as she feared. The neckline was lower than she was accustomed to, the waistline too high, and the fabric, while fine, draped in a way that was clearly not intended for her frame. She looked like a young woman dressed in her mother's clothes. "Aunt Beatrice, I am not sure." "Nonsense. A ribbon at the bodice, and no one will notice. You cannot go downstairs looking like a governess, Clara, not tonight. Lord Ashbourne will be there, all the unmarried gentlemen will be there." The thought of Lord Ashbourne's cool grey eyes assessing her in this ill-fitting gown made her stomach clench. "I am not in pursuit of a husband, Aunt." Her aunt paused, her expression softening for a moment. "My dear, at your age, every woman of sense is. But tonight, let us simply aim for you not to be overlooked." She pinned a silk rose to the high waistline, a small gesture that did, in fact, improve the look. "There, you will do." As Clara took one last look in the mirror, she saw a woman who did not quite fit. The gown was a compromise, her place in this house a concession, her very presence an anomaly. She was on the edge of something grand, but not part of it. Resolved to make the best of it, she lifted her chin and followed her aunt out the door. Chapter 2. A rainy afternoon in the library. The Easter ball was everything she had feared and more. The ballroom at Hawthorne was a cavern of shimmering light, with crystal chandeliers casting 1,000 rainbows over the swirling dancers. The orchestra played with vigour, and the air grew warm with the press of bodies and the scent of gardenias. Clara danced twice, once with the bashful curate, who trod on her toes, and once with a kind but elderly admiral who spent the entire dance describing his gout. For the rest of the evening, she sat with the other wallflowers, her fan in constant motion against the heat of her cheeks, watching the spectacle unfold. She watched Lord Ashbourne, too. He danced with the precision of a man who had been taught the steps since childhood, but without any visible pleasure. He partnered the lady in Rose, who she learned was Lady Cecily Vance, the daughter of a marquess and widely considered the most eligible match in the county. They made a handsome pair, his dark hair and her fair, their steps perfectly synchronized. But Clara noticed that while he performed the motions of a suitor, bringing her lemonade, leading her out for a second set, his gaze often drifted, unfocused, as if his mind were on something far away. She also saw the Dowager Countess for the first time. A formidable woman in purple silk, with a face that might once have been beautiful, but was now a mask of aristocratic composure. She sat on a dais at the far end of the ballroom, her eagle eyes missing nothing. Clara felt her gaze sweep over her once, dismissively, and was grateful for the anonymity. The weekend continued. Saturday dawned bright, but was quickly overtaken by heavy spring rain, turning the planned morning ride into a quiet, indoor affair. Aunt Beatrice had secured a place in a card room with some of the older ladies, and Clara, pleading a headache from the previous night's late hours, excused herself. Seeking solitude, she wandered the vast corridors of Hawthorne House. The grandeur was overwhelming, but she found herself drawn to a quieter wing of the house, where the walls were lined not with portraits of haughty ancestors, but with bookshelves. The smell of old paper and leather beckoned her, and she pushed open a heavy oak door to find the main library. It was a cathedral of knowledge. The room was 2 stories high, with a gallery running along the upper level, accessible by a spiral staircase of wrought iron. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, packed with leather-bound volumes, covered every wall. The rain lashed against the tall windows, creating a soothing, rhythmic patter. A fire blazed in a huge stone hearth, and a few reading lamps cast pools of warm light. It was perfect. She was alone. Clara let out a sigh of relief, the first genuine release of tension she had felt since arriving. She wandered the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines, murmuring titles under her breath. Here was a first edition of Milton, a complete set of Shakespeare, travelogues, histories, and a section of natural philosophy. Her father's library had been her sanctuary, and this room felt like a kindred spirit. She selected a volume of poetry, a collection by Cowper she had not read, and settled into a deep leather armchair near the fire. For the first time all weekend, she felt a measure of peace. She was so engrossed in the verse that she did not hear the soft click of the door opening, nor the footsteps on the carpet. Miss Whitmore. His voice was low and resonant, and it sliced through her solitude like a blade. Clara started, the book nearly slipping from her grasp. She looked up to see Lord Ashbourne standing a few feet away, silhouetted against the dim light from the windows. He was dressed more casually than the previous evening, in a dark brown coat and buff-coloured breeches, his cravat tied in a simple knot. He held a book of his own, his thumb marking his place. "My lord!" She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. "Forgive me, I did not mean to intrude. I lost track of time. I shall leave you to your privacy." "You are not intruding." He gestured for her to sit. "This is a library, not a private parlour. It is meant to be used." He hesitated, then added, "And it is a pleasure to find someone in here who is not merely looking for a quiet place to conduct a liaison." A startled laugh escaped Clara before she could stop it. The comment was so unexpected, so wryly humorous, that it broke through her reserve. She saw a flicker of surprise, then something like amusement, cross his own features. "I assure you, my lord," she said, resettling herself, "my intentions are purely literary." "I am glad to hear it." He moved to a chair opposite her, placing his book on the small table between them. "Cowper," he said, glancing at her volume. "An interesting choice. Most young ladies prefer a novel." "I enjoy novels as well," Clara replied a little defensively, "but Cowper's reflections on faith and nature feel particularly appropriate for the season. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. There is a solace in it." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she held his gaze, determined not to be the first to blink. "My father," she found herself explaining, "was a clergyman. He was fond of Cowper." "Then you have the advantage of me," Lord Ashbourne said, a shadow passing over his face. "My own father was fonder of his horses." There was a bitterness in his tone that spoke of old wounds. Clara, recognizing the vulnerability beneath the proud exterior, felt a flicker of sympathy. "He left you a beautiful legacy nonetheless," she said softly, gesturing around them. "This house, these lands, and this library, it is a treasure." He followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It is a monument to duty, to expectations." He picked up his own book, turning it over in his hands. It was a volume of sermons. "I am expected to be a certain kind of man, to fill a certain role. This place, this legacy, it comes with a script." His grey eyes met hers. "Do you ever feel that you are playing a part, Miss Whitmore?" The question caught her off guard. It was far too personal, far too direct for a proper acquaintance. And yet, it resonated with a truth she had been feeling all weekend. She thought of her ill-fitting yellow gown, her place as her aunt's companion, her careful smiles. "Every day," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. A silence fell between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a silence of mutual recognition. The rain continued its soft assault on the windows, and the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He was the one to break it. "You are staying for the Easter service tomorrow morning?" "Yes. My aunt is most keen to see the church decorated. She says the Dowager Countess spares no expense." "No expense," he repeated, a faint, sardonic smile touching his lips. "It is a production. But the lilies are always beautiful." He leaned forward slightly. "Will you save me a seat, Miss Whitmore? The family pew can be isolating." The request was scandalously improper. A gentleman did not ask a lady to reserve him a seat at church. But there was a plea in his eyes, a crack in the proud facade, that spoke of loneliness. Clara found herself nodding. "Of course, my lord." A log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The moment stretched, charged with a new awareness. Clara's pulse quickened. She realized with a start that they were alone, unchaperoned, in a secluded part of the house. Propriety screamed that she should make her excuses and leave. As if reading her thoughts, Lord Ashbourne rose. "I should not keep you from your poetry, but I am glad we met here, Miss Whitmore. It is refreshing to have a conversation that is not about land values or marriage settlements." He bowed, a formal gesture that seemed at odds with the intimacy of their conversation. Then he retrieved his book and left, the door closing softly behind him. Clara sat frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The library, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt charged with his absence. She stared at the chair where he had sat, the ghost of his presence lingering. He was not what she had expected. Beneath the reserve there was a sharp intelligence, a dry humour, and a deep-seated weariness that called to something within her own soul. She picked up her book, but the words blurred before her eyes. She was not reading Cowper's reflections on divine providence any longer. She was replaying every word, every glance, trying to decipher the meaning behind them. He had asked her to save him a seat at church. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, or perhaps it was a thread, a tentative connection in a world built on barriers. Clara hugged the book to her chest, a strange, budding hope unfurling within her, as fragile and as tenacious as the first spring crocuses pushing through the cold earth. Chapter 3. Ribbons, Flowers and Music. By Sunday morning, the rain had ceased and the world had been washed clean. Clara awoke to a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue and a sun that poured liquid gold through her window. The air that drifted in was crisp and sweet, carrying the scent of damp earth and new grass. She dressed with more care than before, choosing a gown of simple white muslin, a gift from her aunt that had remained unworn. It was modest, high-waisted and long-sleeved, but it fit her perfectly. She pinned a sprig of artificial ivy, a nod to the season, into her chestnut curls, and for the first time all weekend, felt like herself. The church of St. Michael's was a short walk from the house, and the guests were invited to proceed on foot. It was a deliberate choice by the Dowager Countess, a tradition meant to humble the grandest guests before they entered the house of God. Clara walked with her aunt, who was lamenting the damp ground ruining the hem of her velvet cloak, but Clara paid her little mind. Her eyes were scanning the crowd ahead. She saw him almost immediately. Lord Ashbourne walked alone, slightly apart from the main group, his head bowed in thought. He wore a coat of deep charcoal, and his tall hat was tilted against the morning sun. He was a solitary figure amidst the chattering throng, and Clara's heart went out to him. The church was a vision of Easter glory. The interior, usually austere and whitewashed, had been transformed. Garlands of ivy and early spring flowers, daffodils, primroses, and masses of white lilies wound around the columns and draped the altar. The scent was heady, almost intoxicating. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor with patches of ruby and sapphire. Hundreds of candles flickered on stands, their flames creating a soft, ethereal glow. Clara found a seat in a pew near the middle, not presuming to sit in the family section. She had just settled herself when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to find Lord Ashbourne. "You promised to save me a seat," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Her breath caught. "I did not think you meant it," she whispered. A flicker of a smile. "I rarely say things I do not mean." He slid into the pew beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers. Clara was acutely aware of the whispers that rippled through the congregation behind them. She could feel her aunt's gaze boring into the back of her head. But Lord Ashbourne seemed unconcerned. He knelt to pray, his face composed, and Clara followed suit, seeking a moment of calm in the storm of her own emotions. The service was beautiful. The vicar, a gentle man with a kind face, spoke of renewal, of hope, of the stone rolled away from the tomb. He spoke of Easter as a time to shed the burdens of the past and embrace the promise of new life. Clara listened, her father's voice echoing in her memory. She felt the familiar comfort of the words, the reassurance that even in the darkest of times, there was a dawn. Beside her, Lord Ashbourne was a still, silent presence. Once, during the hymn, "Jesus Christ is risen today," their voices rose together, and she felt him glance at her. She did not dare look back, but a warmth spread through her, as tangible as the sun on her face. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard, where the Easter garden party was already beginning. The lawns of Hawthorne House, which sloped down from the terrace, had been transformed into a wonderland of spring. Long tables groaned under the weight of cold ham, roasted chickens, early asparagus, and delicate pastries. There were tents of striped canvas to shelter guests from the sun, and everywhere, ribbons, pink, yellow, blue, and green, fluttered from poles, trees, and the bridles of the horses. A string quartet played from a makeshift stage near the lake, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the happy shrieks of village children who had been invited for the traditional egg hunt. They were already running across the lawns, their baskets swinging, searching for the brightly painted eggs hidden in the shrubbery. Clara stood at the edge of the lawn, taking it all in. The scene was idyllic, a painting come to life. But her senses were attuned to one person. She saw Lord Ashbourne being waylaid by his mother, the Dowager Countess. The two of them stood near the terrace, their conversation stiff and formal. The Dowager's posture was rigid, her words clipped. Even from a distance, Clara could see the tension in Lord Ashbourne's shoulders. He nodded once, curtly, and then turned away, walking towards the lake. Lady Cecily Vance appeared at his side, her rose-coloured walking dress a perfect match for the blooming azaleas. She placed a hand on his arm, her smile brilliant. Clara watched as he paused, his expression once again unreadable. He offered Lady Cecily his arm, and they began to walk along the water's edge, a picture of aristocratic harmony. A sharp pang of disappointment, sharper than she had any right to feel, pierced Clara's chest. What had she expected? He was the heir to Hawthorne. She was a parson's daughter with a patched wardrobe. Their conversation in the library had been a moment of kindness, nothing more. She was a fool to have read anything else into it. "Miss Whitmore." She turned to find Major General Ashworth, the hunting enthusiast, bearing down on her with a glass of ratafia. "Thought you might like some refreshment. Dreadful crush, isn't it? Not a patch on a good day's hunt, though. Say, you look a bit peaky, not coming down with something, I hope." "No, thank you, Major General. I am merely enjoying the view," Clara managed, accepting the glass. She spent the next hour in a daze, making polite conversation, watching the children find their eggs, and trying, and failing, to keep her eyes from drifting towards the lake where Lord Ashbourne continued to walk with Lady Cecily. Once, she saw him look back towards the main lawn, his gaze seeming to scan the crowd. She quickly turned away, pretending a sudden interest in the ribbon-bedecked maypole. The garden party began to wind down as the afternoon wore on. Guests started to drift back towards the house to change for the grand Easter luncheon. Clara was about to follow when she noticed a small commotion near a large willow tree. A little girl, no more than 5, was sobbing uncontrollably, her egg basket empty beside her. Clara's instincts took over. She hurried over and knelt beside the child. "What is the matter, little one?" The girl looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I can't find any," she wailed. "The big boys took them all. There's none left for me." Clara's heart melted. She looked around and saw that indeed the older children had been greedy, leaving the younger ones with nothing. "Well, we cannot have that," she said, her voice firm but kind. "An Easter without eggs is no Easter at all. Shall we look together? I have a feeling there might be some hidden in the most unlikely of places." The girl sniffled, her tears subsiding. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Clara smiled, offering her hand. "My father used to say that the best treasures are always the ones that are hardest to find." For the next quarter of an hour, Clara and the little girl, whose name was Rosie, combed the edges of the garden. Clara, remembering her own childhood hunts, looked in the places children often overlooked, under the low-hanging branches of a rhododendron, behind the stone base of a statue nestled in the fork of a gnarled old apple tree. Each time they found an egg, Rosie's face lit up with delight. They had found 6 eggs, a respectable haul, when Clara spotted a final one, painted a delicate lavender, perched on a low stone wall. "There," she said, pointing, "your crowning glory." Rosie ran to retrieve it, clutching it to her chest. She turned back to Clara, her face radiant. "Thank you, miss, you're the nicest lady here." Clara laughed, brushing the dirt from her skirt. You are most welcome. That was a kind thing you did. The voice came from behind her. Clara whirled around to find Lord Ashbourne standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. He was alone. Her heart gave its familiar, traitorous leap. It was nothing, she said, her cheeks warming. The little ones should not be left without. You found her a lavender egg, he said, a strange softness in his eyes. That was my favourite colour as a child. My grandmother used to hide one especially for me. He paused. You have a natural way with children. Not everyone does. Clara was flustered by his attention. I was a child once. I remember the disappointment. She hesitated, then added, I thought you were walking with Lady Cecily. A shadow crossed his face. Lady Cecily is an accomplished woman, but she finds the village children's egg hunt beneath her notice. She retired to the house some time ago. He took a step closer. I have been watching you, Miss Whitmore. The directness of his statement stole her breath. My lord, you should not say such things. Why not? Because it is not in the script? His voice was low, intense. The script says I should be with Lady Cecily. It says I should discuss land drainage with my steward and ignore a young woman who shows kindness to a child. But I find I am tired of the script. Clara's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. I am merely a guest of my aunt, Lord Ashbourne. I have no place in your world. You know that. My world, he said, his grey eyes burning into hers. Is this a garden? A child? An act of simple kindness? He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her own, not quite touching. Perhaps I am trying to find a place in yours. Before Clara could respond, the sound of a gong echoed across the lawn, signalling the call to the grand Easter luncheon. The moment shattered. Lord Ashbourne stepped back, his mask of reserve sliding back into place. I must go, he said, his voice tight. My mother will be expecting me. He gave her a short, formal bow. Miss Whitmore. He walked away, leaving Clara standing by the willow tree, her heart a battlefield of hope and despair. He was heir to an earldom. She was a parson's daughter. His mother would never countenance such a match, and yet he had looked at her as if she were the only person in the garden. He had said he was tired of the script. She watched him disappear into the crowd, her mind spinning. The Easter luncheon was about to begin, and with it, the final act of this grand performance. She had no idea what role she would play or what lines she would speak. But for the first time since arriving at Hawthorne House, Clara Whitmore felt that she was no longer merely a spectator. She was standing on the precipice of something real, something that could change her life forever. Chapter 4. A Grand Easter Luncheon. The Grand Easter Luncheon was held on the vast south lawn, where a series of marquees had been erected to form one enormous pavilion. The tent was a masterpiece of decoration, draped in swaths of white and pale green fabric that billowed gently in the spring breeze. Inside, round tables covered in crisp linen were set with the Dowager Countess's finest china, each place setting adorned with a single white lily and a handwritten name card. The entire county seemed to be there. Clara, seated between her aunt and the vicar, could barely see the end of the table. The meal was a procession of courses: delicate soups, poached salmon, spring lamb with mint sauce, early peas and new potatoes, and a dizzying array of desserts. Lemon syllabubs, fruit tarts, and a towering Easter cake decorated with sugar flowers. But Clara could not taste any of it. Her eyes kept drifting to the head of the table, where Lord Ashbourne sat beside his mother, the Dowager Countess. On his other side was Lady Cecily Vance, her laugh ringing out like silver bells. Clara watched him cut his lamb with precise, mechanical movements, his face a mask of politeness. He did not look her way. You are not eating, Clara, Aunt Beatrice whispered, her voice sharp, and you are staring. It is not done. Forgive me, Aunt. I am merely tired." Her aunt gave her a shrewd look. "Be careful, Clara. I did not bring you here to make a spectacle of yourself. Lord Ashbourne is spoken for in all but name. Lady Cecily's family is expecting an announcement this weekend. The Dowager Countess has made it quite clear." The words hit Clara like a bucket of cold water. Spoken for. Of course. The walks in the garden, the dances, the prominent seat at the luncheon, it was all a courtship, a carefully orchestrated performance. The conversation in the library, the look by the willow tree, had been a momentary lapse, a rebellion against his script that he would soon forget. She nodded, her throat tight. "Of course, Aunt. I understand." For the rest of the meal, Clara kept her eyes on her plate, her heart slowly hardening against the foolish hope that had taken root. She was a sensible woman. She had known from the start that this was a fairy tale, and fairy tales did not come true for parsons' daughters. After the meal, the tables were cleared and the marquee was transformed for dancing. A small orchestra struck up a lively country dance, and the younger guests began to form sets. Clara, her spirits at their lowest ebb, slipped out of the pavilion and into the gardens. She needed air, she needed space, she needed to remind herself who she was and where she belonged. She wandered along a gravel path that led to a secluded rose garden, not yet in bloom, but peaceful in its bare, ordered symmetry. A stone bench sat beneath a trellis of climbing roses, just beginning to show the first hints of green. She sat down, her hands folded in her lap, and let the quiet wash over her. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry over a man she had known for 2 days. She would not be that woman. She was Clara Whitmore, and she had weathered far worse than a broken heart. "Miss Whitmore." She closed her eyes, his voice. Again. "I thought I might find you here." She did not turn around. "You should not be looking for me, Lord Ashbourne. You should be inside, dancing with Lady Cecily." He did not respond to the barb. Instead, he walked around the bench and stood before her, his tall frame blocking the afternoon sun. His cravat was slightly askew, his hair ruffled, as if he had been running his hands through it. He looked for the first time not like the heir to Hawthorne House, but like a man at war with himself. "I am not going to marry Lady Cecily," he said. Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "My mother wishes it. Her family wishes it. The entire county expects it. But I have spent the last 2 days trying to convince myself that I could do it, that I could play my part, marry a woman of suitable rank, and spend the rest of my life in comfortable, passionless duty." He knelt down on one knee before her, so that his face was level with hers. "And then I met a woman who helps a child find a lavender egg, who quotes Cowper by a fire, who looks at a library as if it were a cathedral, and I realized that I cannot." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Lord Ashbourne, you cannot mean—" "My name is Henry," he said, his voice rough. "My father called me Henry. My grandmother called me Henry. I would very much like you to call me Henry." "Henry," she whispered, the name feeling foreign and yet achingly right on her lips. He took her hand, his fingers warm through her glove. "I know what people will say, that you are not of my rank, that it is a misalliance, that I am throwing away my duty for a fleeting fancy. But this is not fleeting, Clara. I have known you for less than 2 days, and I know, with a certainty that frightens me, that I have been waiting my whole life to meet you." Tears spilled over Clara's cheeks now, and she made no move to stop them. "But your mother, the expectations. I am no one, Henry. I have nothing." He lifted her gloved hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers. "You have everything that matters. You have kindness, you have grace, you have a heart that sees beyond titles and estates." His grey eyes, so often cold and distant, were blazing with intensity. I do not want a woman who fits the script. I want a woman who will help me write a new one. From the direction of the marquee, they could hear the strains of the orchestra, the laughter of the guests, the sounds of a world that expected Henry to be inside, dancing with Lady Cecily. But here, in the quiet of the rose garden, with the first green shoots of spring pushing through the soil around them, another world was being born. "I am frightened," Clara admitted, her voice small. "So am I," he said, and the admission, so honest, so vulnerable, broke down the last of her defences. "But Easter is a season of courage, is it not? Of new life, of stone rolled away?" He released her hand and reached into his coat, drawing out a small velvet box. "My grandmother gave me this before she died. She said I would know the right woman when I met her. She told me to give it to her when I was ready to be braver than I had ever been." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a ring, a stunning oval emerald, the colour of spring grass, surrounded by a circle of tiny diamonds. It was old, valuable, and unmistakably a family heirloom. Clara stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. "Henry, I cannot accept that. It is too much." "It is not enough," he said simply. "It is a promise, Clara, not a guarantee. I cannot promise that my mother will accept this. I cannot promise that society will be kind. But I can promise you that I will never let you face any of it alone. I can promise you that my heart, which has been closed for so long, is yours." He took the ring from the box. "Will you allow me to be braver than I have ever been? Will you stay? With me?" The music from the marquee swelled, a waltz. The scent of the damp earth and the first tiny rosebuds filled the air. The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the garden in a warm, golden light. It was, Clara thought, as if the world was holding its breath. She looked at the man kneeling before her, proud, reserved Lord Ashbourne, who had read sermons in the library, who had watched her from across a crowded room, who had confessed his loneliness in a church filled with lilies. He was offering her not just a ring, but a life, a partnership, a chance at a love that defied the rigid lines of their world. Slowly, she extended her hand. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now, ringing with a conviction she had not known she possessed. "Yes, Henry. I will stay." With hands that trembled only slightly, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his face was not a mask. It was open, vulnerable, radiant with a joy that took years from his features. He rose to his feet and drew her up with him. They stood facing each other in the rose garden, her hand in his, the emerald ring glinting in the sunlight. "I should take you back," he said, but he made no move to leave. "They will be wondering where we are." "Let them wonder a little longer," Clara said, a smile tugging at her lips. It was the first time she had spoken with such confidence, such disregard for propriety. She felt giddy, weightless, as if she were floating. He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "As you wish." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the celebration a distant hum. The world they were about to face together, the Dowager Countess's fury, the gossip, the uncertainty, loomed before them. But in this moment, there was only this. Two people who had found in each other the courage to be themselves. "We should tell your aunt first," Henry said finally. "She will need to be prepared before we face my mother." Clara nodded. "She will be shocked. But I believe beneath her social ambitions, she wants me to be happy." "And you are happy?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up at him, at the man who had seen past her ill-fitting gown and her modest connections, who had valued her kindness over her consequence. She thought of her father, who had taught her that Easter was a time of new beginnings, that hope could bloom in the most unlikely of soil. "I am," she said. "I am more happy than I have ever been." He offered her his arm, and she took it, the weight of the emerald ring a comforting presence on her finger. Together, they walked back towards the marquee, towards the music and the laughter, towards a future they would build together. As they emerged from the garden, they were met by the sight of the Easter celebration in full swing. The village children were dancing around the maypole, their ribbons weaving a pattern of bright colours. The older guests were seated at the tables, sipping champagne and watching the younger set whirl across the dance floor. And there, on the terrace, stood the Dowager Countess, her face a thundercloud, as she watched her son approach with a woman of no consequence on his arm. Henry's grip on Clara's hand tightened. "Ready?" he murmured. She lifted her chin, drawing strength from the ring on her finger, from the warmth of his hand, from the hope that Easter had brought. "Ready." They walked up the terrace steps together, and the conversations around them began to falter, then die. All eyes turned to the heir of Hawthorne House and the unknown woman at his side, her hand resting on his arm, a brilliant green jewel gleaming on her finger. Aunt Beatrice, seated near the Dowager, let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Lady Cecily Vance, mid-laugh, froze, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. The music faltered for a moment before the conductor, with remarkable presence of mind, struck up a new tune, a lilting, joyous air that seemed to fill the marquee with light. Henry stopped before his mother, Clara at his side. The Dowager Countess rose from her chair, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Henry," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Explain yourself." He did not flinch. He looked at his mother, then at the assembled guests, then back at Clara. His expression was calm, resolute, and utterly, devastatingly proud. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the marquee, "may I present Miss Clara Whitmore, the woman I intend to marry." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The Dowager's face went pale, then flushed an alarming shade of red. "You cannot be serious," she hissed, low enough that only they could hear. She is the woman I love," Henry interrupted, his voice unwavering. "She is the woman who has shown me what it means to live without a script, and I will not apologize for choosing her." Clara felt her heart swell with love for this man, this proud, reserved man who was defying everything he had been raised to be for her. She stepped forward before the Dowager could respond and made a deep, graceful curtsy. "Your ladyship," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I know I am not what you expected for your son. I have no title, no fortune, no connections, but I promise you this. I will love him with all my heart. I will support him in all things, and I will strive every day to be worthy of the honor he does me." A long, agonizing silence followed. The entire party seemed to be holding its breath. The Dowager's eyes, sharp as flint, bore into Clara's, searching for weakness. Clara met her gaze without flinching. Then, slowly, something shifted in the Dowager's expression. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was a crack. A grudging respect, perhaps, for the courage of this unknown woman who stood before her without flinching. "We will discuss this later," the Dowager said finally, her voice clipped. "In private." She turned to the assembled guests, a brittle smile plastered on her face. "A toast," she announced, raising her glass. "To new beginnings. It is Easter, after all." The tension broke. The guests, unsure of what they had just witnessed, but eager to comply with the Dowager's command, raised their glasses. "To new beginnings," they echoed. Henry took Clara's hand and led her onto the dance floor, ignoring the whispers that followed them. The orchestra, taking its cue, struck up a waltz. He pulled her into his arms, and they began to move, a single entity in the center of the floor. "You were magnificent," he murmured against her ear. "I was terrified," she confessed, her heart still racing. "I know. So was I." He smiled down at her, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. "But we did it together." They danced, and for that one perfect moment the world fell away. There was no dowager countess, no gossiping guests, no rigid expectations. There was only Henry and Clara, moving in perfect harmony, their hearts beating as one. When the dance ended, they walked out onto the terrace, where the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Below them, the gardens of Hawthorne House spread out in all their Easter glory. The maypole, the children with their baskets, the tables laden with flowers, the spire of St. Michael's in the distance. Henry stopped and turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I know this is not the proposal you deserved," he said, his voice soft. "It was hasty and public, and I should have asked your aunt's permission first, but I could not wait another moment." "It was perfect," Clara said, and she meant it. "It was real." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the emerald ring. "Then let us make a promise, here and now. In this garden, on this Easter day. Let us promise each other that no matter what the world throws at us, we will face it together. That we will write our own story, without a script. That we will always be brave enough to choose each other." Clara looked into his grey eyes, seeing not the cold, distant air she had first encountered, but the warm, passionate man beneath. She thought of the library, the church, the little girl with the lavender egg. She thought of her father's words about hope and renewal, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was her resurrection, her new beginning. "I promise," she said, her voice clear and strong. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their promise beneath the Easter sky. And behind them, in the marquee, the music swelled, the laughter continued, and a new chapter began at Hawthorne House. Epilogue. Spring Renewal. 1 year later, the gardens of Hawthorne House were once again blooming with Easter flowers, but this year there was a new Lady Ashbourne. Clara Whitmore, now Countess of Ashbourne, stood on the terrace, a basket of painted eggs on her arm, watching her husband chase their giggling goddaughter Rosie across the lawn. The Dowager Countess, who had taken a full 6 months to come around, now sat in a comfortable chair near the terrace, a shawl around her shoulders, a smile on her face as she watched her son act the fool for a child. Aunt Beatrice, now Lady Ashbourne's cherished companion, was pouring tea for the vicar, who had come to bless the new rose garden that Henry had planted in Clara's honour. "Aunt Clara! Aunt Clara!" Rosie came running, her face flushed with joy. "Uncle Henry hid an egg in the top of the oak tree. I saw it glinting." Clara laughed and handed her the basket. "Then you must go and retrieve it, but be careful climbing." Rosie scampered off, and Henry came up the terrace steps, his hair mussed, his cravat loosened, looking nothing like the proud, reserved air of a year ago. He looked like a man who had finally found his place in the world. "You are a terrible influence on that child," Clara said, but her eyes were shining. "I am an excellent influence," he countered, sliding an arm around her waist. "I am teaching her to be adventurous, to look for treasures in unlikely places." He kissed her temple. "It served me well." They stood together, looking out over the estate that was now theirs to steward. The gardens were a riot of spring colour, tulips, daffodils, and the first roses beginning to bloom. The church bells of St. Michael's were ringing in the distance, calling the faithful to the Easter service. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question he asked her every day, as if he still could not quite believe his good fortune. Clara turned to him, seeing in his grey eyes the reflection of her own joy. She thought of the shy, out-of-place woman who had arrived at Hawthorne House 1 year ago, convinced she did not belong. She thought of the rainy afternoon in the library, the garden party, the Easter morning service. She thought of the courage it had taken to stand on this very terrace and face a room full of hostile strangers. And she thought of the promise they had made, to write their own story, to choose each other, every day, against all odds. "More than I ever thought possible," she said. He kissed her, right there on the terrace, in full view of the vicar, her aunt, his mother, and the entire household. And no one, not a single person, looked away in embarrassment. They smiled instead, because the sight of Lord and Lady Ashbourne, so clearly in love, was the most beautiful thing Hawthorne House had seen in years. The bells of St. Michael's continued to ring, and somewhere in the village a choir was singing the old Easter hymn. "Now the green blade rises from the buried grain, wheat that in the dark earth many days has lain. Love lives again, that with the dead has been. Love is come again, like wheat that springs up green." In the garden, Rosie found the lavender egg in the oak tree and let out a shriek of delight. The Dowager Countess poured herself another cup of tea and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Aunt Beatrice dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. And on the terrace, Clara and Henry stood entwined, watching the sun rise on their Easter morning, ready for all the springs yet to come. For at Hawthorne House, in the heart of the English countryside, love had found a way, and in the season of renewal, of hope, of stone rolled away, it would bloom forever. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the